And our topic here is Arab Spring. And just in the most basic terms, and Ken, we're going to start with you. What happened to spark the kind of change that was all of a sudden in the news just over a year ago?
Right. Well, people attribute the changes that took place with the self-emulation of Mohammed Bouazizi, who was the street vendor in Tunisia, who set himself on fire because the police had confiscated his vegetables and fruit stand. And what he was reacting to was this notion, in a sense, of a predatory state, the idea that he was treated with indignity, and this was an act of the ultimate defiance. And it was a view that this sparked what we now call the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening. But for those of us, both IRI and NDI, who were working on the ground for the past 15 years in the Middle East, while we could not predict when this would erupt, it certainly didn't surprise us, because what we have seen working on the ground was civic organizations, political parties, reformers, some of whom were in government, some of whom were in opposition, that there was a growing sort of discontent in the region. Desire, as I said, for human dignity, a reaction against the corruption of the state, the power of the state, the way individuals were being treated. So while we couldn't predict when the eruption would take place, we knew something was going to happen. And so the spark really was a sort of an evolution of people being dissatisfied with government. Then you add to that the youth bulge, the communications revolution, not only Twitter and Facebook and the social media, but also satellite television. For the first time, people saw themselves as something larger, that this was a very insular region. The countries within the region were very insular. They hardly traded with each other, communicated with each other, and so satellite television had a huge impact. You added to that fraudulent elections that nobody participated in, and all of this became part of a pot that led to what took place last January.
Well, Lorne, let me put a different edge on this. We talk about that region. Is it a region, or is this a country-by-country thing, in your opinion, and how do you look at that?
I think you can look at it both ways. It's certainly a region in terms of culture and history, but I think it is interesting that so far countries that are run a particular way have not had these revolutions, and countries that are run a different way have. And by a particular way, I have said for a while, if you wanted reform in your country, if you wanted more democracy, get a king. The joke was that countries that had monarchies, they were modernizing more rapidly than the republics. So if you think about a place like a Jordan, a Morocco, an Oman, a Qatar, you saw more modernization. And the reason was the young kings had come back, they had been educated overseas. And they had come back and they basically said, Dad did a great job getting us going in terms of oil or some kind of industry. Now my job is to get the politics, to start reforming the politics around here. And it's not that they want to give up power or even at the moment be a constitutional monarchy, but they do see a reason to get more advice from their citizens on the way they should be running things. Ironically, the countries that were set up as republics had become ossified. So you had places like Egypt, Algeria, Libya, Syria, etc., where they didn't have monarchies. They were supposed to have elections, but over time the system had politically become ossified. And therefore, the kind of elements Ken was talking about, this steam was building up more and more over the years. That does not mean you're not going to see change in the monarchies, but they, in large, partly because of their wealth, partly because they have already given in on some reforms way back to the 1990s, there's a lot less pressure within that cooker.
It's interesting when you talk about the small event touching off something that had been brewing. And I know in the room here we have some people who are real students of history, and there's this allusion you almost can't help but make to one assassination in Serbia leading to World War I after all the dominoes go down. And we'll talk about that more in the future here. Lorne, when we talked ahead of time, you said there were three key aspects of the Arab Spring that were important on energy supply, war, and Israel. Talk about that.
Well, the question I was asked was, why should we care? And my answer is, this is a really, really important region for us. And those of you who are involved in this town in energy certainly understand that over the last 2 decades, we have basically had to send our sons and daughters to the region 3 times. And it's in part, this region is of great interest to us because of energy supplies. And so we have to be focused on that, and that's something else I hope we talk about later, about why it's so important, what we're seeing now with natural gas and domestic energy, why that is so important. I mentioned that we've had to go to war there 3 times. And the final thing I would say is we do have a very, very close connection to the state of Israel. It's easy for us who were born after World War II to forget, but the reason we have this close association is because of what happened in World War II when basically nobody else wanted to help. And President Truman stepped forward, and we remain the closest of friends to Israel today. So that's going to be important going forward, regardless, as we talked before, of the possibly diminishing importance of the Middle East in terms of our energy supplies.
Mm-hmm. It's a matter of standing up for the future, is a phrase I've heard you talk about on Arab Spring. Standing up for the future within the Arab Spring, the people there. In what way?
Well, I think Lorne is absolutely right in terms of what our interests have been in the Middle East. And my first boss in Washington, matter of fact, called it the petro-diplomatic complex. That we cared about oil, we cared about diplomacy because of peace. These were all important to our national security. It was important for peace in the region. But it led us to have relationships with very small groups of people within each of these countries. We didn't have relationships with the people. And we were always we were very transactional in terms of our approach. We were looking to cut a deal on a peace process, looking to cut a deal on an oil arrangement, on trading issues, and we relied on the relationships with the leader of the country. But we did not have a country strategy. And I think it's one of the reasons why we were caught by surprise with the Arab Spring. And I think now we realize that we have to have a much more people-centric policy in this region. And now there are many centers of power in these countries. And sometimes it's always easier dealing with non-democratic countries. It's much easier dealing with an individual where you can cut a deal or make an arrangement. But now people are demanding different systems. And the Middle East was the one region of the world where sort of the traditionalists believed democracy would not take root or the demands would not take place. It started, in a sense, the third wave in places like Spain and Portugal. It went to Latin America, then the fall of the wall, and then Africa and Asia. But the Middle East somehow was seen as sui generis. And I think what happened was, last year, it shattered all of those perceptions. And I think going forward in the future, we've got a much more difficult, but much more important task, and that is to develop broad and deep relationships with society in these countries. Because we have a lot, in a sense, we have to have a point of repair in many of these countries because of those very narrow relationships.
Well, question then, either one of you picked this up then. Knowing that and not thinking about parties, have we learned and are we doing anything different?
We kind of have to learn this lesson every few years. We kind of learned it with Marcos and Pinochet in Chile in the 1980s. We kind of learned it again after the fall of the wall. I will say the culture has changed. Ken often talks, and I can attest to it, having been at the State Department. I was at the State Department from 89 to 92. Very little interest in democracy issues then. That was 20-some years ago. It was just beginning after Chile and Philippines. Now it's a completely different mindset at the State Department. It doesn't mean that human rights is the first issue, and maybe it shouldn't be the first issue. But whereas it used to get very short shrift, very little consideration, it certainly gets higher consideration. But the lesson we keep having to learn is exactly what Ken said. We all say, oh, Kyrgyzstan thinks, or Egypt thinks, or China thinks. And what we're referring to when we're talking about authoritarian countries is the person who is running it thinks. And what Kenneth said is absolutely true, that instead we need to have these broader and deeper relationships. After after Marcos went, after Pinochet went, they were maybe, quote, less reliable allies, but we have a much healthier relationship today with the Philippines or with Chile writ large, the whole population, than we did when they were under Pinochet or Marcos, and that was all we cared about. But that's a lesson we keep having to relearn.
And I would just add one thing, that people are in a demanding mood around the world, that people simply don't want to put food on their table. They want to put food on the table. They want to have a job. They want to have housing. They want to be productive, but they also want to have a political voice. And they wanted both. And I think we have begun to understand this, that we have to respond to these universal aspirations that people have, irrespective of where they reside. Because now this is a global phenomenon. It isn't just in a country or a region. And the interconnectedness of the world has allowed this to take place much quicker than it would have 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Okay, recently the Jerusalem Post had a story, and I want to get each of your reactions, that White House Deputy National Security Advisor Dennis McDonough, just to mention names if we have to, we can say he was to blame, speaking at a Washington Institute for Near East Policy said, while the change in the Middle East is working against Iran, it can work for the United States. A more democratic region will ultimately be more stable for us and our friends. He said that the transition in Egypt, in particular, is the most important in the region, and the United States has supported the transition because it's consistent with our values and interests. You agree?
100%.
I do.
Really?
Yeah, I think he said some very, very important things. One of the things I'm finding is when we talk about the Arab Spring, people saw headlines in the Washington Post or the AP or any newspaper last fall saying Arab Spring turns to Arab Winter. We gave them 6 months; they couldn't get it straight. The hell with them. After decades of dictatorship. And one of the things I tell people is this is going to take a long time. If you don't want to play the game, get out now. But this is a 10, 15, 20-year process of transition in the Middle East. We are not going to be able to tell the course, the future of the Middle East by the first election or the second election. It's going to be the fourth or fifth election by the time we start figuring this out. What we do need to do as the United States is to stay engaged in the process if we want to see it come out with the kind of thinking or the kind of vision that we would all like to see. These countries are always going to be different from us. They're going to be more conservative, in a religious sense, certainly. And we're going to have to accept that. But if we hope that they will be forward-looking, outward-looking, thinking about the future, not the past, we need to stay engaged. If we don't, there are plenty of other countries, starting with Saudi Arabia and Iran, that are more than happy to take our place and more than happy to try and affect the course of events in places like Egypt and Tunisia and Syria.
What's interesting about Dennis's comments, and Dennis is a good friend, and before he entered the White House, he worked for many years for Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because this is the Deputy National Security Advisor. This is not the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and Democracy at the State Department. And Dennis is a hard-nosed realist. He's not a starry-eyed human rights person. But there has been, I think, a sea change in attitudes among people who are there to serve sometimes the most narrowest interests of the United States. And I think that even if you talk to the anti-terrorism advisors at the White House who are dealing with a country like Yemen, where our major task is going in to kill people before they can kill us, they also now care about politics. They care about what's going on in Yemen. They care about negotiations between the government and the students. They understand that democratic politics also ultimately produces stability. That the problem with authoritarian leaders is it all seems stable until it becomes unstable. And there's this eerie sense of stability. But ultimately, if you don't have legitimacy, that ultimately that becomes very ephemeral, that it's going to evaporate. And I think that there's now a growing recognition among both the idealists and the realists in Washington that, yes, you have to serve short-term interests, and you have to deal on certain things to achieve those short-term interests, but ultimately our national security interests and the interests of peace globally is when countries become more democratic and that people have a voice and governments have to account.
Doesn't legitimacy come with maturity? And how do we balance that out? Because they don't start and in 10 minutes are accepted.
No, but yes, it takes, as Lorne said, it takes a long time. But that's why you have to begin now. I remember having a conversation with the president of Kazakhstan, and he made this case that this takes 25, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. And I said, Mr. President, that's why you have to begin now. But it can't wait because people are going to demand it. And so therefore, it is the height of arrogance to say that somehow people have to wait 20, 30, 50, 100 years so they can have their fundamental economic and political rights. Because they won't wait 20, 30, 50, or 100 years anymore. They will demand it now. And the role, I think, for the United States and the international community is to respond to those demands and those aspirations. And it's going to be difficult. And there will be places where it will get worse in the short term. And so this is an ongoing process right now, but ultimately a process that I think reflects, universal values and ultimately the best interests of our country.
One of the countries that we haven't mentioned is Afghanistan, and while it technically may not be considered Middle East, it certainly is a close enough neighbor. And whenever you look in the news, the Afghanistan stories are right by the Middle East stories. And we talked about war and getting out and such things as that. So let's shift over a little bit. Your impressions on Afghanistan and what you see ahead. Start over here.
Why don't you start?
I think in the long term, this is going to be a place now. Everyone has been very fearful that 2014 is the end of international engagement in Afghanistan. And I think what is taking place now between the United States and its NATO allies, which will be a subject in Chicago next week, will be another decade, not of military presence and military forces, but major international support and international engagement in the country. So when the Afghans look at the international community, it's not going to be a 2-year proposition, but rather a 12-year proposition. And I think that's terribly important. I think if we were to pick up stakes and leave now, it would be a disaster for the country, disaster for the citizens, terrible fate for women in the country. And so therefore, I think it requires a continued engagement. I think the challenges are enormous. I think the Taliban still has great strength in the country, and in certain parts of the country. I think there is a government in which has demonstrated corrupt elements, and you have weak political institutions. You have citizens who feel totally disconnected from governing structures, and that's why the effort is going to have to not only develop a partner in Kabul that it can trust and has the best interests of its citizens, but also subnational governments where citizens will connect with their elected leaders at the provincial and local level. But it's going to be a very, very long road ahead of us, but an important one that I think we have to be on.
Okay.
I would agree that it's going to be a long-term challenge. I'm actually quite worried about what happens when we leave in 2014. And it's not entirely dependent on us, obviously. It's hugely dependent on the Afghans, hugely dependent on how they govern their country, and most of all in 2014, whether their security services are ready to take over the job. But I really worry that if they aren't, the interest of the world has waned. I was reading an article coming down here about how the Europeans are saying, look, we care about North Africa, we care about Belarus, but Afghanistan's a long way away. And I know the American people are weary too, and I can understand that after 10 years. So I'm a little worried about what's going to happen in there in just a few years. And I think it's important, if you read the history of groups like Al-Qaeda, they take great encouragement when we leave somewhere. If you read about what bin Laden said of why we were a paper tiger. So just at the time when they are certainly on their heels, when bin Laden has been killed, I would hate within a few years to offer them some encouragement.
When you look at these kind of uprisings, being students of history yourself, do you see any corollaries that you look back to try to find some lessons that we ought to be thinking about, that this looks the same as something else that we'd seen in the past?
Well, within our lifetimes, most people have reached back to Central Europe. And I think there's some parallels to be drawn. A lot of people have looked back at revolutions in the 1800s, 1848. But it's all different, and one of the things we have to do, there's a great book for those of you, I've met so many of you who study or are teaching international relations, a great book by Graham Allison called Lessons in History. But it points out how I'll get the title. It points out how it's good to look back at past examples, but you can't draw exact parallels. So for all of us who have grown up, in the last half of the 20th century, we all immediately thought Central Europe, but there are great differences. There's this religious overlay that you have just for starters. In Central Europe, the communists had left, they were completely discredited. And the only other alternative at the time, it being the end of history, was democratic capitalism. Here, the non-ideological dictators are leaving, and there are basically two alternative paths on which to go. So it was not a foregone conclusion in Central Europe as much as we like to remember that it was, but it's certainly not a foregone conclusion in the Middle East.
Do you look at any parallels?
Well, it's hard to go too far back, because I think what has changed today, people say, well, look, it took us 200 years. But those were different 200 years because of the interconnected world and because of the communication revolution. So, people won't wait 200 years now. There was a time in Latin America where people said, well, because of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, Latin America was not predisposed towards democracy, or the Latins' sort of admiration of the Caudillo. There was a view of Africa being a tribal society, and that was not fertile ground for democracy. It was Asian societies of Confucianism and consensus, and it wasn't compatible. It was Islam and democracy. It was Germanic cultures and democracy. So there were always the so-called experts, the sort of pessimists, who always believed that change was not possible in these places because people somehow were not interested in finding their own voice or being engaged in political affairs. And all of those experts were proved wrong. And I think and all of them cited culture and history and events in the past to buttress their position. And it's because they had very little connection with people on the ground. And so I think for both organizations, when we have offices all around the world, we have very talented staff. We have staff from 88 nationalities. When we walk into a room in a country now, you can almost identify, they speak different languages, sometimes they look different, but you can identify the civic activists and the party leader and the labor leader. All these people, F. Scott Fitzgerald once said, give me an individual and I'll show you a type. And everybody plays that role. There are more similarities. There's a common humanity around the world, and if you are engaged in this type of work, if you are on the ground working with very courageous Democrats who sacrifice much for often things we take for granted, you realize that there is much in common, and there are very few things that differentiate people around the world.
That's an interesting viewpoint, because one of the questions I had was a poll that Foreign Policy magazine did among several experts, and they said the number one threat to a positive outcome was political fragmentation. Everybody looking for their own small interests, and to be able to look for that tie. It's interesting. Let me jump to a different kind of a tie, and I'll give a heads up to everybody. I've got one more question, and then there's a microphone there. It's being recorded, so if you have questions, go to the mic, and we're going to start taking those after this. One of the things about Charlotte, it's very much involved in the energy industry, and that's a particular interest of mine, and I know several people here in the room. And by the way, if you're comfortable in this room today compared to being muggy outside, thank a nuclear operator up at McGuire. Small plug as we go through this. You can't talk about the Mideast without talking about energy. We ship a lot of dollars there. They ship oil over here, and there is, with that, a variety of baggage that we carry. From what you've seen in the Mideast, you know, and in a community like Charlotte that is very interested in energy, what's the message that you have here for people in Charlotte and in this room?
Well, I mentioned at the beginning the development, what we're seeing in terms of natural gas, what we're seeing in terms of more and more shale oil coming in from Canada. And I as somebody who lived through the energy crisis of the 70s, who's watched what's happened, like I said, these last 20 years, it's a terribly, terribly important thing. I think it ranks up there with what are we going to do about the deficit and demographics in this country, about the future of this country. I've got 3 kids, the oldest is 14, and if none of them ever had to worry about going into the military, going to the Middle East, in part because of our energy supplies, then I think that would be a huge contribution that this generation can make. Not that America's ever going to be, quote, energy independent, that's a lot to ask, but if we are not so dependent on one region of the world for our energy, if we can produce enough domestically, get enough from Canada, Mexico, Venezuela will turn out okay, Western Africa, et cetera. If we're not so dependent just on one region, that would be a huge amount of freedom for our country.
Okay.
I believe, you know, conserve, produce, diversify. I think we have to do it all. And because I think we found out in the Middle East that we can't rely on any particular source. And so therefore, we, I think, have to invest, and we have to do as much as we can to produce. We have to find ways to conserve as well. I think if our ultimate goal is to reduce our reliance in a certain part of the world, we're doing a great service to our country, and I think ultimately stability in the region as well. And I think at the same time, we have to ensure with the countries that are dealing with in the Middle East that they're responding in a way that those energy sources are not being threatened. And it's sometimes not just hunkering down in what they would view as self-preservation, but it's responding. What's going on, for example, in Bahrain now, it's affecting the entire Gulf. And what I fear is they're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Talk about what's going on in Bahrain. Put it in context for people that may not be aware.
Well, there is a great fear right now in the Gulf, and it's one that dominates all the dialogue of Iranian influence and, more importantly, Shia influence, particularly in places like Bahrain, where the majority of the population is Shia, and where you have the Khalifa family and the Sunni minority that runs the country and has benefited basically from the wealth of its neighbors. And basically the Gulf believes right now that the Arab Spring and U.S. support for the Arab Spring has become a dire threat to their survival. And their response to that has been to go after some of the more moderate people in the region. It's not me.
Just checking.
Phone check.
Okay. In fact, we should turn this off. And what they're doing is not only going after radicals, but what they're doing is they're going after the moderate middle. They're going after people who want to achieve reform, promote greater participation, and they're creating what, in a sense, Mubarak created: no alternative to an authoritarian regime. It's either us or the radicals. And so right now this is playing out now in the streets of Bahrain with the support of other families in the region. And I think it's something that we all have to watch very closely because this can unfold in a very, very negative way.
Okay. Question, Bob.
Bob Morgan with the Charlotte Chamber. Thanks to both of you for being here. Thanks in advance to NDI for the 350 representatives of foreign governments who will be here the week of the Democrat National Convention. We look forward to the opportunity to introduce them to Charlotte and strengthen our business ties. My question is, where does China fit into the story of the Arab Spring?
Who wants that?
China is really interesting because if we all think nothing's changed in China since 1989, that it's still a very repressive country. We just had this dissident, and there's this drama that took place over a couple days. So you could be forgiven for thinking that nothing has changed there since 89. But what happened in 89 was the government of China made a bet. They made a different bet from the government of Cuba or North Korea or Belarus or until recently the government of Burma. And their bet was that if we don't change, we die. If we don't allow reform in China, then we will not survive. And predominantly that has been economic reform. And the reason was because the communist ideology had essentially lost legitimacy after 89. And after Tiananmen, and after all that had happened in China over the previous 20 years. But along the economic change caused political change. And so you had, just to give one small example, they used to produce rice in communes. Communes weren't producing enough rice for the growing population. So they said, we'll get rid of the communes, you all can grow, you have to grow a certain amount of rice and give it to us, but after that you can grow whatever you want. Well, when they got rid of the commune, it was the lowest form of political organization in the country. So they had to come up with an alternative to the commune. And what they did, they started sending people down from provincial capitals, from Beijing, to run these villages. And the villagers said, who is this guy? Get him out of here. And somewhere in China, a village said, we're going to elect our own representatives. So what you've seen for the last 15, 20 years in China is villages electing their own leaders. And what is happening, and there are reforms going on across the board in media, some in labor, in terms of even the internal workings of the Communist Party. And what has happened over time is that the Chinese people have been allowed to let off steam slowly. The government turns the faucet just a little bit every couple of years. But the problem is, as we all know, when you give people a little freedom, they want a lot more freedom. And so what's going on inside China now is not unlike what you saw in the Middle East. It's not that every person in China has a Statue of Liberty under their bed and they all want, quote, democracy. That wasn't the case in the Middle East either. But what people in the Middle East said they wanted was dignity and justice and respect. And what does that mean? Well, it means I'm the fruit seller. I don't want the government guy hitting me or woman hitting me up for a bribe the whole time. If I want to have more of a say in what goes on in this country. And when you parse out what folks mean by dignity and justice and respect, the only system that anybody has come up with all its imperfections, to be able to address those things is a more democratic system. But this is a dilemma that the Chinese government is having right now, that they're across the board, there are these increasing demands for dignity and justice and respect. And the Chinese Communist Party, which is highly centralized, cannot figure out how to deliver more dignity and justice and respect from Beijing. And Wen Jiabao has been a relatively, in their system, good ruler. When he hears of injustices in a village, he will go out and help the farmer. But Wen Jiabao only has so many hours in the day to help farmers, and he can only answer so many letters in a day. And this is the fundamental problem that China is having, is how to devolve authority to address those issues of dignity and justice and respect without devolving authority, because they really don't want to do that. And when we talk to them, and we do talk to government people in Beijing, because we do programs inside of China, they are fixated on this, on how can we govern well and govern better. But they're
without elections.
Without elections. But they're in this dilemma. They're in this dilemma. So we've had some really fascinating, even amusing conversations with them. about this subject. But as Ken said, for decades, even, as late as December of 2010, people said nothing's going to change in the Middle East, and it changed the next month. It will not happen that soon in China, but watch China.
What's, I think, challenging in these situations, and if you look at the Middle East, if you look at what's happening in Russia, and this bears out in China too, sometimes the reaction among elements is not necessarily sort of liberalism is going to blossom, because a reaction to the predatory state, and the same is true in Russia, it's produced also ultranationalists too that have reacted against Putin. In the Middle East, people ended up voting for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt not because they believed in an Islamic state, but the Muslim Brotherhood was the only thing that they knew, because Mubarak didn't allow anything else to emerge in the country, and they could talk politics in the mosque. And the Muslim Brotherhood was seen as being uncorruptible. And therefore, their reaction to Mubarak was not necessarily a liberal alternative, but it could also be a conservative alternative. But that's not where people are. People are ultimately in the middle. And unless the Muslim Brotherhood either changes and moderates, they'll be out, or they'll change, as the AK party in Turkey under Erdogan changed. And if you look at their platform when he was mayor of Istanbul to where he is now as head of government, it's a much different party, and he's a much different leader. So that's why we're optimistic if we have patience, because ultimately the people in these societies want certain basic things, and that's where you get the extremists that go off to the margins. And I think what we're already seeing is the Brotherhood changing, and also the Brotherhood losing popularity in Egypt over the last couple months. So the phenomenon is playing out in Egypt now, and we just have to be patient and be supportive and be engaged.
As we talk about this, you and I are both from Chicago. What's an election?
What's an election? Well, there was always a story in Chicago, a woman who, because you always Riverside Cemetery, it was people were always waiting for the returns from Riverside. Yeah. But it led a woman to say that I was born in Chicago, I was raised in Chicago, I will die in Chicago, and I want to be buried in Chicago so I can stay active in politics.
Before we go to the next question, talking about politics, we do have the DNC here. You've got an event at the DNC.
Yes.
Give us a quick heads up on that.
Well, every 4 years, NDI hosts and organizes a program for the international community at the Democratic Convention. This started in 1984 in San Francisco and has grown every 4 years since then. So here in Charlotte, and some of you may have met my chairman, Madeleine Albright, who was here a couple months ago, sort of introduced this program to the community here. We will be bringing about 120 ambassadors and about 300 foreign leaders from around the world, from every region of the world. These are heads of state, parliamentary leaders, political party leaders, and we will have them for an entire week at the convention. And there aren't too many times where you have leaders from around the world that come to a community for 4 days, political leaders. And so we will have not only receptions, but we will have a series of seminars, and we're fortunate to have the Belk Theater that seats, I guess, 2,000 people. So not only will our seminars for foreign leaders and political leaders in the United States before the foreign leaders coming in, but also the community will be able to participate in these as well. And so we hope all of you will be engaged. What's unique about this is all of our panels are bipartisan. So we will have Republicans and prominent Republicans and Democratic politicians and journalists and others engaged in domestic politic issues as well as international issues. And since we have to raise private funds for this, we still have an opportunity to sell these various receptions and panel sponsorship. So any of the corporations in the room that want to be part of this, that's my pitch.
There you go. Okay. Question?
Hi, I'm Paul Prohaska from Bank of America. Thank you for being here. I'd like to return to the discussion of Bahrain for a minute. Prior to the Arab Spring, Bahrain was presented, marketed as if it's a tiny sovereign state, and I think the Arab Spring either proved that that wasn't or wouldn't be true to some extent. It's really just part of Saudi Arabia. Could you talk about the pros and cons of an official annexation of Bahrain by Saudi Arabia, how that would be received, and if you'd see that as even being possible in the next several years?
In annexation, some would say it's already annexed, because ultimately Bahraini security is being guaranteed by the Saudis. I don't know whether that's an alternative, because what you do have is you have the end of the royal family in Bahrain then, the Khalifa family. Certainly Saudi Arabia would see itself as a guarantor of Bahraini sovereignty and a guarantor of the survival of the Khalifa family because of its fear in the eastern province, which is predominantly Shia. And so therefore they see if Bahrain becomes an extension of the eastern province in the eyes of the Saudis, then it would be seen as a mortal threat.
They may not want it.
And so therefore, why would Saudi Arabia want an additional Shia population added to its eastern province? So I doubt whether the Saudis would want it. But I think right now the Saudis believe there's only two things that separate it from Iran, and that is the Khalifa family and the Fifth Fleet, the U.S. Fifth Fleet. And so that's why they're acting in such, I think, an aggressive way right now. But unfortunately, as I said, that the Khalifa family and the government of Bahrain is acting in a way that is self-defeating. Because what they have done is they've turned demands for democracy, because it was not a Shia-Sunni divide when the demonstrations began on Pearl Square, but it has now become a Shia-Sunni divide. And the initial calls for reform led to further calls for a constitutional monarchy, and now you have a sizable portion of the country that would want to see the end of the Khalifa family. So I think the answer to all of this on the part of the government of Bahrain is serious negotiations, constitutional changes, serious negotiations, and I think the international community has to be engaged. But to do that, we have to take on the Saudis and take on the rest of the Gulf, and it's a very, very difficult proposition. And I understand how difficult that is because of all those other interests.
Quick follow-up?
Yeah, so would Saudi then be willing to cede it to a government that was Shia-dominated in Bahrain?
I think the Saudis would say this is a mortal threat to our survival, and they would do everything in their power to prevent it. And they would tell the United States to stay out of our territory. And those messages basically, I think, have been delivered. It's a very, very tense time in the Gulf right now, but I think a very tense time, a very dangerous time, and I think it requires, as I said, it requires negotiations, it requires reform, and right now the Gulf states are not in the mood for that.
Gulf states are petrified of Iran, really. They look at it, as he said, as an existential threat, and at the moment nothing else matters to them.
You have to understand you have leaders of the Gulf state who are coming to Washington almost on a weekly basis urging the United States to bomb Iran. I mean, this is, and these are not private messages. They meet in think tanks, and they're very open in terms of what they want the United States to do.
Question.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Osama Wazan. I just returned from the Middle East, by the way. Last week I was in Damascus, Syria, arriving 3 hours after an explosion went off. About the Shiites in Bahrain, by the way, I rode with 2 taxi drivers in Lebanon who said they will never perform pilgrimage until Saudi turns into a Shiite state. to confirm what you were saying. I have a comment to say. One is the Arab Spring term is a misnomer. I think right now, from what I have seen, is that people are caught, Arabs meaning Jews, Christians, and Muslims, caught in the cycle of provocation and retribution. They are actually, it's no longer about freedom or democracy, it's about revenge. The revolutionaries who I met with were actually talking about not settling until they take revenge.
In Syria.
And their tears of sorrow are dried with those thoughts of revenge.
This is in Syria.
This is in Syria. The question that I have, I keep hearing on the news, and with all due respect, you mentioned that we have interests in the Middle East, and it's public. We all say we have interests in the Middle East. And we take a lot of measures into forging relationships with the leaders in the Middle East to protect these interests, the energy interests. Arabs know that. The street knows that. The civilians know that. They are left to fend on their own when America cuts deals with the heads of states, et cetera, and the monarchs. That's what gave birth to the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, because people were left to fend off on their own. What are your organizations doing differently to close that gap between fulfilling the needs of the civilians and also protecting our interests? Thank you.
You've identified the nub of, I think, the challenge for the United States. And I would recommend, we had our annual democracy event last November, and I would ask you to go on to our website, and Hillary Clinton gave the keynote address at that event, and it was a 40-minute address about this issue, and how do you balance all of these interests, these short-term interests, and they all come to the surface, and they're most apparent. It's true in lots of countries around the world, but it's most glaring in the Middle East, and this challenge is most glaring in the Middle East. You know, we you know, in a sense, I don't want to be flippant about it. It's easier to advocate for change and democracy in Belarus and Zimbabwe than it is in a place like Bahrain and even Egypt, because of so many other interests on the bilateral agenda and on regional agendas and on energy and things like that. And I think this, and she talked about how you respond to these various challenges. So you can go on our website and read it. I think it's an interesting speech, and she was very, very open and honest with it. And I think, you know, we are non-governmental organizations, and we are not government. And we protect our non-governmental status all the time. We're not agents of the U.S. government. But I think we would both argue that indirectly we do serve U.S. interests, and even where we sometimes complicate short-term national security interests, we are supported by the government because they recognize that, because there are some places in the world where the issues that you talked about, our relationships with the people, the democratic aspirations, the desire for freedom and openness, comes into conflict with a relationship that we have to have with the government. So in some places, democracy is a high policy for the United States. It's the number one, the number two issue in terms of that relationship. And we are then high policy. And there are some places where it isn't high policy for the United States. But then we become an important part of the relationship between, I believe, the United States and the international community and the people of those countries. And the United States invests in the type of work that we do. And I think, and Lauren mentioned this earlier, I think that there has been a sea change in the way the United States deals in these countries. There was a time, Lauren mentioned Ferdinand Marcos, who lost that election to Corazon Aquino in 1986. And I remember when we went into a Latin American country, and the U.S. ambassador at that time said, "What are you doing in my country? You're not going to export the Philippine people power revolution here." You don't get an ambassador that says that anymore. Because now this notion of democracy and human rights, civil society, people-to-people relationship, government-to-people relationship is now part of every ambassador's agenda. Every ambassador has to have democracy as part of his or her portfolio. Now, in some places it may be fifth and sixth, in some places it may be one or two. And I think in the Middle East, I think we learned an important lesson, and that it was not a major part of our bilateral relations. And I think we're playing catch-up. But I think that there's a real realization that we have to have many more relationships as a country beyond the governments in these places, because there's other centers of power. But the balance that you talked about how do you do both when you have short-term security interests and longer-term interests in the society? This is the challenge for diplomacy in our government. But we play an indirect role in that, I think, by projecting the people-to-people relationship that you talked about.
Lauren, any comment?
Yeah, just having worked within government a couple times, this is the issue within government, is how are you going to balance the U.S. government's primary job, which is to protect the United States, with the urge that we feel because of our history, because of how our country was founded, to help others. To begin with, there's not a lot of countries that feel like we do, that we ought to be helping others. But because we feel that, we talk about it a lot. And I would also commend to you Secretary Clinton's speech. You heard George Bush talk about it. You heard Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan talk about it. So it's fair to ask, how are you measuring up to your words? And I don't think there's a country in the world where the dissidents would say America's doing enough. You know, I don't need any more help. Because ultimately, in all of these countries, it's not America's job to bring change to the country. It's the job of the people in the country to bring change to the country with U.S. help, but it's their fight, not ours. Now, as to the role we play, we both had a think tank, a big Washington think tank, come to us about 8-9 months ago. And the woman came in who was doing this study, and she said, well, the CIA missed it again, and DOD missed it again, and the State Department missed it again, this Arab Spring. How come you guys knew it was coming? And as Ken said at the beginning, you know, I looked and said, look, if you had asked me a month before the fruit seller burned himself, I could not have told you that was going to happen in Tunisia. But we knew, as we said at the beginning, that this tinder was getting laid, and we could see the tinder rising higher and higher. And we were all just waiting for the spark, and we knew it was coming. We said 3 to 5 years max. And she said, well, how did you know that? And I said, because the embassies and the CIA and all those guys, and I've seen it because I was one of them, they all live in these high-walled embassies 10 miles outside of town now. They've all been built to be highly secure. And they talk to people who speak English and wear ties. And we talk to people who have no idea what English is, never worn a tie in their life. And that's how we know these things are going to happen. So it often happens that we are working not at cross purposes with the U.S. government, but that we are helping people that they aren't talking to. And funnily enough, some of those people get to be the leaders of their countries in not too many years. And what we have not infrequently had happen is that we know these people, but the embassy doesn't. And we have helped these people over time. You know, they came into some of our seminars kind of interested in politics, then they became a member of a city council, then they became a member of parliament, and now they're the prime minister or president of the country. That's happened in a lot of countries we work in, but we often have to introduce them to the folks at the embassy. They haven't met them before.
It's important, too, that people do fear change. I mean, the establishment fears change. I mean, it's understandable. And it goes back, you know, again to the Philippines and Chile. I mean, there was a great concern in the United States of, okay, we understand that Pinochet is a dictator and everything else, but what's the alternative? The alternative to Pinochet is going to be a communist insurgency. And the alternative to Marcos is a communist insurgency. That was the view of those two countries at the time. And we had been working with all of those groups that were marginalized by these two extremes. And in a sense, Pinochet and the communist insurgency and Marcos and the communist insurgency needed each other. They had a symbiotic relationship. In the same way, Mubarak and the Brotherhood had this symbiotic relationship, and they both drew strength from each other. And in that process, the whole center was marginalized. And those two events, 1986, the snap presidential elections in the Philippines, 1987, the 1988, the presidential plebiscite in Chile, what happened was the awakening of that middle. And finally, policymakers, I think, in the United States understood that there was something between these two extremes. And that created, that in a sense ended the debate over whether the United States should really, the partisan debate over the United States should engage in this overseas, because they realized that there was something in the middle of these extremes. And I think the same thing will be playing out in the Middle East too, if, as Lorne talks a lot about, if we have patience.
This is going to be a quick question, then we have two wrap-up questions up at the panel.
It's Nabil Alvi from Bank of America. A question for you. Do you envisage a situation where the U.S. will provide or give unconditional support to the Arab revolt and let it sort of evolve naturally, or it would try to control or maybe manage the end game here?
Well, I would just say what I said before. It's their country, not ours, and it's their fight, not ours. Anybody who thinks that the United States can control events in these countries, especially a place like Egypt, is dreaming. Partly because we don't understand the country well enough to control it, partly because we wouldn't want to, and partly because people in the country wouldn't want us to. I think what we have been able to do is to back the aspirations of people in those countries to take the country, we hope, in the right direction. But it's not within our control where they end up. It's within the control of the people in the country. We can help them, we can give advice, we can support them. But the idea that the United States, for example, I listen to a lot of people saying, oh, we should have backed Mubarak. Why? So he would have lasted another 48 hours? It would have made absolutely no difference to the people in Egypt if we had backed Mubarak, and in fact, it would have left us in a far worse position afterwards to have backed him like that. So just at the end to say it's not within our control. There are probably some people out there who wish it was, but it's not.
Or some people who believe we are,
Yeah, exactly.
when we're not.
But if you talk about the European military intervention in Libya or the military generals coming in Egypt, do you see that as an effort to manage the outcome?
Well, we don't know the outcome in Libya, do we? I mean, there's a lot, it's, to put it nicely, it's a dynamic situation in Libya, and you can't open the newspaper for a day without seeing something, interesting going on in Egypt. They're going to have to figure it out. What I think we did was, in both cases, finally, to get on the right side of history, to recognize that ultimately in every country, and here I come back to China and other places, these things are going to happen. And we ought to, as we were talking about before, we ought to be working with those people who want the best, want change in their country, if only for our national interest, if only because afterwards, forget all the moral stuff, which is why I think we ought to do it. But if only for the national interest, we ought to be talking to them and helping them.
Okay. Bill, real quick.
Yeah, maybe this can be kind of a wrap-up. I'm interested in nuclear power in the Middle East. The question is, with this type of revolution going on, places like United Arab Emirates that's planning to make investments right away, I mean, they're going to break ground soon for new nuclear power plants. Saudi Arabia has announced they want to build 16 new nuclear power plants over the next 15 to 20 years. How do you feel about that under such conditions?
I think Lorne talked a little bit about different categories of countries. The monarchies and the authoritarian regimes, and I think I think he's absolutely right. The monarchies had a little more legitimacy than the Ben Ali had in Tunisia and Mubarak had in Egypt. But the monarchies are facing a challenge, and that they've got to reform. If you look at the elections that took place in Morocco, and you see young people not participating, and out of the low participation, you had 27% of the ballots that were marked invalid as a protest vote. So there are problems in these societies, in Jordan and in Morocco, and the challenge for these monarchies that do have legitimacy is to ensure that the reform is taking place fast enough and in a genuine way that it keeps up with the expectations of the people. In the Gulf, I think that they have the luxury that they have money and they can pay people off, and that can stave off for a while, a reaction. And I think it has helped, except in a place in Bahrain that is different in the Gulf, because, some of these Gulf countries, you have very small populations and large foreign populations. Bahrain is different. It has civil society and political societies. It has the Shia-Sunni split. It's a much more vibrant place. But ultimately, I think, I'm not an expert on energy issues in the country, on nuclear issues versus oil. But I am worried about stability and the impact that can have on nuclear development in the region, because I think these regimes, unless that they are serious about reform, that there are real dangers on the horizon on all of these options.
We're going to have to get, in the interest of time here, we get two quick wrap-ups. You talked about Madeline.
Oh, sorry, there's a student.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, lights. Here.
Okay. I'm representing MGLA Academy. I want to know how this affects the youth in the United States. How does the Arab Spring affect the youth of USA, United States?
Okay.
It's creating the world you're going to be living in and you're going to be trying to deal with. We have, I've grown up to the point I am, dealing with a particular kind of government in the Middle East with a particular relationship. But the relationship we're going to have with these new hopefully democracies like Egypt and Tunisia, and just to mention why Egypt is so important, the cultural and historical center of the Middle East. If it goes well there, it will be difficult for anybody anywhere else in the Middle East to say it can't be done here, as opposed to if it just goes well in Tunisia or Libya. But essentially, we're living through the period of transformation of the region that the youth of today in the United States are going to be dealing with, just as most of us in this room are old enough to have lived through, and some contributed to, the end of the Soviet Union, and think how that has changed our outlook on the world today. So it will have a dramatic effect in terms of, like I said, whether we have to worry about the military going there, what about our energy supplies, what about it? All of these issues are issues that the youth of today are going to be growing up dealing with.
Let me, two final questions. We've talked about Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton, people you've known in the past. On a nonpartisan basis, and nobody running for president, and nobody who's got a long tenure in Congress, who are the young leaders in America you are seeing today that you think we ought to be paying attention to because they get it?
Ken?
Yeah.
This isn't a good sign.
I can't point to any one leader. I think in Washington, unfortunately, I've lived in Washington for 40 years, and Lorne and I talk about this. This is one of the few issues that you can have a Democrat and Republican sitting here and we can finish each other's sentences.
Yeah.
And people always expect when we go out to speak around the country, they expect crossfire. They expect sparks to fly. and they're a little surprised. I think that I've never seen a situation so polarized as I do in Washington. People don't talk to, they don't socialize, they don't live in Washington anymore. They live in their home districts or their home states. Families don't move to Washington. No one invests in the city, and no one invests in relationships. They come in on Tuesday and they leave on Thursday and Friday. And so it's very, very difficult to identify young people that are trying to overcome this. There are some younger members of Congress, I think, that are trying to deal with this. But I think it's a very serious problem from our own democracy, and trying to find a middle ground. And I think we see it all around the world, too, the polarization, that you have 50% of the population takes one side and 50% takes another. But I do have hope. You know, Lorne talked about his children and my children. I do take hope in those people. I think they're extraordinarily plugged in. They communicate. They care about the world. They care about their community. And so, you know, we may have to skip a generation or two in order for things to get better. But I do believe in that generation of the 20-somethings right now, because they've seen the world like we never saw the world. They've seen diversity much more so than we have. And so they're much more tolerant, and they're much more, they communicate much more with each other and to the rest of the world.
Okay.
So I think that's where my hope is in the younger generation.
Lauren, do you have any names of people that you've gotten to know?
Well, I worked at the State Department many years ago with a crowd that was all under 40, and many of them, like Bob Zellick and Bob Kimmett, I would hope to see in government. They're not young anymore. I will tell you two groups of people I'm really, really impressed by in that younger age category. And I learned a long time ago not to look on the resume at whether they went to Harvard or wherever. The two things that really impressed me, and generally I'm impressed by the people I meet who are either veterans, young veterans, or they were in the Peace Corps. And those are, I think military Peace Corps diametrically opposed. But what impresses me about those folks is the military and living out in a village at the back end of beyond in a country in Africa brings a level of maturity to those people that you would not gain. I meet 25-year-olds who've done that, done their 2, 3, 4 years in Afghanistan, Iraq, or in the backwoods in Africa or Latin America. And it brings a level of maturity that you don't see in 35-year-olds. Okay. Without that experience. So, as I said, I hope my kids don't have to go off to war, but it's one of the few things looking back that I wish I had done.
Okay, so a void you can fill for the students here. Last question.
Yeah.
What is the book that's in your briefcase or on your bedstand right now? Why should people read it?
I've got a couple. One is on teenage boys, since I have an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old, but seriously, I'm reading a good biography of Deng Xiaoping that Ezra Vogel put together that has a lot of hints about where China's going, I think. And a good book by John Gaddis about George Kennan, who is, as some of you know, was one of the great diplomats in American history and came up with the containment theory. Okay. But I like to read biography and history.
Probably wouldn't have been a big supporter of ours.
Yes, he wasn't.
How about you?
Well, I'm reading, it's on my iPad, so it's technically my briefcase, but I'm reading the Madeleine Albright's new book, the Prague Winter, which is about the period between 1937 and 1945, where she talks about her family, talks about her Jewish roots, talks about that period, that very, very volatile and important period in history.
Okay. And I get a final comment here as the moderator, and that's moderator's prerogative. The World Affairs Council here really brings a lot of gravitas to this city. One of the things you may not have seen is that, LJ, where are you? You were chosen to go to Afghanistan as one of a very few number of World Affairs Council people around this country. You did that at the end of March, and that's a testament to what you brought this city. And people need to know that you're chosen and you're representing Charlotte, and we want to thank you for that because you've done us well, and we appreciate that. And also, as we look ahead here, I went online to kind of catch up on the news so I'd know what's going on. This discussion today was just phenomenal. I went on Yahoo News, and the top stories that came up was a guy who's suing a restaurant because he was snubbed at the all-you-can-eat line, and how Kim Kardashian loses weight. Really?
Do I get the answer to that?
How does this help doing anything to our home prices, our energy security? But look at what we have in Charlotte. The people that you saw today are really a microcosm of what Charlotte's really about. I don't know if you've been here before, but you're company for about 10 minutes, and then you're part of the family. No. So you're going to be coming back. We know you're coming back for the convention, but whenever you get tired of Washington, it's not that far.
Man. Thank you.
And you're always welcome back here.
Same time tomorrow?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much. Bob?
I'm Bob Holcomb, and quickly, I just want to thank everybody for coming here today. I do have one or two announcements. The panel that we've heard today with Ken and Lorne, I think you have to agree that it's very seldom you'll ever find a Republican and a Democrat on the same stage, and they didn't get into a fight. They didn't wind up rolling on the ground, primarily because the topic that they're talking about is an international topic that Republicans, Democrats, all of our political parties here in the U.S. support, and that's the promotion of the concept of democracy and fairness to the population. And so I appreciate both of yours ability to come here and talk to us today. Thank you for coming today. I appreciate your interest. Please come at 2 o'clock over at the Charlotte Regional Partnerships Boardroom if you'd like to continue to listen to this event. Thank you.